Hi guys, and welcome to my series called You Don't Need to Buy New Paints Because You Have Paint at Home. This is a series where I do my best to recreate some of these super granulating watercolor mixes that we see hitting the market right now and see if we can recreate them or get a close approximation of them by using paints that we already have. Why am I doing this? Because I own so many paints that I don't need to be buying anymore. I don't need to be browsing Blick. I need to be using what I have. And you might be in that situation too. You might also want to test out a color before you commit to buying a whole tube of paint. So this might be a good series for you. Today we're going to recreate Forest Blue from Schmincke. And you can see on the side of the tube, you see PB36 and PBK11. And that is the pigment information and lets you know what pigments are in this tube of paint. So PBK11 is Mars Black. It's a pretty straightforward color. It's a very granulating color. Different brands of Mars Black will vary in how much they granulate, but the color is pretty consistent across the board. Now, here is where we get into the weeds a little bit. I have 3 tubes of paint that lists PB36 as the only color or pigment in that paint. So we have this one from Mary Blue, which is listed as cobalt green blue, and you can see the pigment number is PB36. So you can see it's kind of almost a cool blue color. Then we have cobalt turquoise from Da Vinci, and this one's a lot warmer. It skews a little bit more green on the color wheel, but again, fairly close in color, just a slight different. But here is where it gets a little trickier. We also have this cobalt turquoise from Daniel Smith, and this one is much more granulating, and it is a lot darker and way more green than our other 2 ones. So which one do we choose? This is where I always struggled when I would hear professional artists say, well, you don't need to buy convenience colors because you can just see the pigment information and recreate that color using the paints you already have if you have pure pigment paints. And that is true in theory, but there is some difficulty in translation and practice, and that's because there is a lot of variation within a pigment. For example, PBR7 is almost universally used to make burnt sienna, burnt umber, and raw umber, all 4 paints that are very different. And the pigment information on the tube doesn't tell you which version of the pigment they're using to create that. It's just telling you what pigment is in it. So this is where you have to use your detective hat a little bit when you are trying to recreate a paint. So when you're trying to recreate a color, you need to really pay attention to the pigments that are being used and kind of think through color theory and your knowledge of opacity and granulation to figure out what version of that color might be the best fit and the role it's going to play in the mixing process. So we know in this one that the Mars Black is going to be the heavy hitter on granulating. It is going to be the main source of granulation for this mix. We also know that the end result was almost green. It was almost like a green-blue color. And because of that, I had a feeling that this Mary Blue wasn't going to be a perfect match. I had a feeling it was going to be too blue and there wasn't going to be enough green undertones if I wanted to stick with matching the pigments exactly and not add a 3rd color to try and push it a little bit more green. Now, there is no rule saying that you can't add a 3rd color to try and recreate these matches, right? You might not get an exact pigment for pigment recreation of that color, but that's okay. It's not that big of a deal. So you might have a PB36 that looks more like the Mary Blue, and it's a little bit too cool. We'll just add a little bit of green to it and see what happens. Or experiment with different greens and see if you can kind of push it closer to what you want the end result to look like. And you might find that you have to substitute for an entire pigment because you don't have it in your collection. So you might have Mars Black, but you don't have this PB36 color in your collection, and that's okay. See what you have that is similar and could get you close to it. So you could substitute with like maybe a cerulean blue and add a little bit of green to it. You could substitute with a different cobalt color. So my cobalt teal from M. Graham is PB28, and it is very similar to the Da Vinci color that you see on the page, but a smidge more green and more granulating. And that would make an excellent substitution if I wasn't trying to do a pigment for pigment match. You might even have to do like more of a green color and add blue to it. So you could do like a cobalt green, so like PG 50, and then add some blue to it to cool it off a little bit. So you have to get a little bit creative. I did find that Mars Black is a difficult one to substitute because it is the main source of granulation in a lot of these kind of super granulating mixes. And so you could use other blacks, but they're not going to give you the granulation effect that you might be looking for. So that one might be difficult to substitute, but you know, you can get creative with some of your other colors. While I was yapping with you guys, I finished swatching all 3 variations of this color recreation. Now within each color, I did mix up the ratios of blue and black and water to see what I could create and which one would get me the closest. And on the top row is the pure pigment version of that color. Now we are going to swatch out the Schmincke color. And I'm lucky enough to have this tube on hand, which makes the comparison a little bit easier. Some of these colors that I've recreated using online photos are a little bit more difficult because I know the pigment number, but how that paint looks varies drastically depending on the marketing photos being used and the lighting in which those photos were taken. I don't know how much water was added to the mix. Like there's just a lot of variables that you have to kind of navigate through if you're just going off of online marketing photos. But here is the Schmincke color swatched on the paper next to our examples. And I would say the Daniel Smith is our closest in general. Now that little card you see there, that one is going to look slightly different because that paint was swatched directly straight from the tube and on a different type of paper. And so that does affect how a color will look. The texture of that paper is different, so it will affect how it granulates. And when I swatched it straight from the tube, some of the binder had separated, which affects the sheen of the paper or the paint. So here I am swatching the Daniel Smith one again, but this time I'm doing a little bit more of a value scale so I can see how those paints look diluted out and see if that match holds up when diluted. Because one thing I did notice when I've recreated some of these colors is in concentration, it looks like a similar color, but when you dilute it out, it doesn't match anymore. And so it's just something to keep in mind when you are doing these recreations. So that is it for our latest installment of You Have Paints at Home and You Don't Need to Buy Anymore. If you guys like this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to see more of what I create here on this channel, please hit the subscribe button. And I hope you guys have a great day and I will see you next time. Bye.